January 20th, 1945. Versailles. Inside the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower is holding a report that was never supposed to reach his desk. This isn't a report about a victory or the movement of troops. This is evidence of something dark growing within the American ranks. He has just learned the truth about what happened in the village of Chinon. 60 German prisoners, disarmed and with their hands in the air, executed in cold blood. If he moves forward with this report, George S. Patton, the legendary Old Blood and Guts, could face a military court-martial in the middle of the greatest battle in American history. If he stays silent, he becomes an accomplice. Today, we are opening the file that was meant to be burned. We will explore the moment a future president of the United States stood between the laws of war and the iron necessity of victory. This is the story of what Eisenhower actually did when he realized his top general was covering up a war crime. While the world watched the front lines of the Ardennes, a completely different drama was unfolding in Eisenhower's office. The military police report on the events in the Belgian village of Chinon was devastating. The Battle of the Bulge was coming to an end. The Allies had held their ground, but the cost was incredible. Eisenhower had built the image of the United States as a force of light, crusaders bringing law to a shattered Europe, and suddenly, 60 prisoners executed by soldiers of the 11th Armored Division of Patton's Third Army. Eisenhower immediately summoned his aides. He demanded to know why this had only come to light now, 2 weeks after the incident. For Ike, this was not just a legal matter. It was a strategic nightmare. He understood that if the Nazis found out, Joseph Goebbels would use the Chinon execution to convince every German soldier that the Americans were no different than the SS. He would tell them not to surrender and to fight to the death. This wasn't just a question of justice. It was a question of whether the liberators were turning into the very enemies they came to fight. The moral foundation of the U.S. Army had cracked at the worst possible moment of the war. The scene shifts to the Third Army headquarters, where the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Eisenhower made direct contact with Patton, and it wasn't a friendly call between colleagues. He demanded an immediate and brutal explanation. The facts were already leaking through the command chain. Patton knew about Chinon long before the military police finished their report. In fact, we now know from Patton's private diaries that he had personally intervened to prevent the news from spreading. We must hush this up. It would only serve to embolden the enemy and demoralize our own men. To Patton, the 60 dead Germans weren't a moral crisis. They were a logistical inconvenience. He viewed them as inevitable casualties of a war that had become increasingly primal. The boiling rage from the Malmedy massacre, where the SS had slaughtered American prisoners just weeks earlier, had turned his soldiers into judge, jury, and executioners. But despite his personal fury at the breach of discipline, Eisenhower hesitated. He was a man who understood the value of public image better than anyone. Patton was the hero of Bastogne, the face of American aggression against the Nazis. The press worshipped him, and the soldiers feared him just enough to follow him into hell. To relieve him of command now, in the heat of the Ardennes counteroffensive, would have been a catastrophic blow to the morale of the entire Third Army. Eisenhower made a calculated, cold-blooded choice. He decided not to refer the case to the Judge Advocate General immediately. He deliberately stepped outside the formal military legal system. He gave Patton a chance to handle it internally, which everyone understood meant burying the evidence under the chaos of the front lines. Eisenhower later wrote, "Patton is our finest instrument for victory, but he is also our greatest headache." This was the moment the Supreme Commander chose the general's efficiency over the letter of the law. In doing so, he made Patton his debtor, a debt that would be paid in German territory, but at a staggering moral cost. At the very same time, this secret drama was unfolding in the shadows of Versailles. American military tribunals were in the middle of intense preparations. They were building ironclad cases against SS officers like Joachim Peiper for the Malmedy massacre. The world's eyes were fixed on the United States. Washington had positioned itself as the supreme moral judge of Nazi brutality, claiming to represent a higher civilization that followed the rules of the Geneva Convention even in the darkest hours of combat. Eisenhower found himself in a terrifying, hypocritical position. How can you sentence an enemy commander to death for executing prisoners when your own soldiers, under your direct command, have committed a mirror image of that crime? The contradiction was a ticking time bomb. Ike realized that the risk was not just personal, but existential for the entire Allied cause. If the details of the Chinon execution leaked into the international press, the defense attorneys for Nazi war criminals would have been handed a gift. They would have claimed tu quoque, a legal argument that the Allies were no better than the perpetrators they were trying to hang. This could have paralyzed the entire legal and moral framework of the post-war world before the first gavel even fell in Nuremberg. It would have turned the liberation of Europe into a messy, vengeful brawl where both sides were equally stained. Eisenhower had to ask himself, can justice wait until the guns fall silent if the price of immediate truth is a massive propaganda victory for a dying Nazi regime? This wasn't just a tactical delay or a legal loophole. This was the moment Eisenhower truly understood the heavy weight of the Supreme Commander's coat. It requires more than just moving divisions on a map. It requires the stomach to deliberately compromise your own principles to preserve the greater objective. If you find this exploration of history's gray areas compelling, consider subscribing.
We don't just tell you who won. We tell you what they had to become in order to do it.
The Supreme Commander made his final, cold decision. The official military police investigation into the village of Chinon was effectively strangled in its cradle. Eisenhower did not push for a public trial or a high-level court-martial for the soldiers of the 11th Armored Division. He ensured that the paper trail ended abruptly. As a direct result of this high-level intervention, not a single American soldier was ever executed or even severely punished for what happened in that Belgian snow. The officers involved were not stripped of their rank in disgrace. Instead, they received quiet, private reprimands or were shuffled between units to break up the collective memory of the event. The original documents regarding the execution were stamped with the highest level of secrecy and buried deep in the National Archives, where they remained untouched for nearly half a century. But make no mistake, Ike didn't just ignore the rot. He was a master of discipline. Shortly after the incident, he issued a new, blistering directive to every commander on the front lines. It reinforced the Geneva Convention with the explicit threat of immediate and severe punishment for any future irregularities regarding prisoners. He used the hidden shame of Chinon as a silent leverage point to tighten his grip on the Army's conduct, while simultaneously ensuring the public remained blissfully unaware of the cracks in the American armor. General Omar Bradley later reflected on the grim reality of those winter months, stating, "War is a dirty, bloody business. Sometimes you win it by becoming just as dirty as your enemy to survive." Eisenhower saved Patton's legendary career from a scandal that would have destroyed it, but he also protected his own future. A public admission of a mass execution in 1945 could have turned the American public against the war and ended Eisenhower's political trajectory toward the White House before he ever won an election. He traded the lives of 60 SS men for the absolute stability of his command and the relentless speed of the final advance into the heart of Germany. Looking back across the decades, we have to ask, did Dwight D. Eisenhower make a fatal mistake? From a strictly moral and legal perspective, the answer is a resounding yes. He allowed a documented war crime to go unpunished and actively participated in a conspiracy of silence that deceived the American people for generations. He prioritized the reputation of a general over the blood of prisoners. But from a global strategic perspective, his decision was the backbone of the final victory. He preserved the integrity of the Allied front at its most fragile moment and brought the war to a close without a massive internal scandal that could have fractured the coalition. This event permanently shifted the dynamic between Ike and Patton. From that winter forward, Eisenhower became colder, more distant, and deeply suspicious of his star general. He no longer saw Patton as just a brilliant hero, but as a dangerous loose cannon who was willing to jeopardize the moral standing of the entire nation for a moment of personal vengeance. Victory in the Second World War was not a clean, antiseptic affair. It was the brutal result of 1,000 messy compromises with conscience. Eisenhower chose victory over justice, and in doing so, he showed the world the true face of leadership in total war. We are accustomed to seeing Eisenhower as the smiling, kindly Uncle Ike, the symbol of post-war stability. No, stories like Chinon remind us that in January 1945, he was a stone-cold pragmatist who knew exactly where to draw the line and exactly where to bury the bodies to ensure that line remained intact. What would you have chosen if you sat in that chair in Versailles? A fair and open trial that would have handed the dying Nazi regime its greatest propaganda weapon, or a swift, decisive victory at the price of a buried crime? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation that forces us to look at the heroes we admire and see the shadows they left behind. History doesn't offer easy answers. It only offers the cold reality of the decisions that were made.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe to join us as we continue to uncover the truths that were meant to stay hidden in the dark.